The steel teeth gleamed under the Normandy rain. 4 jagged prongs, welded to the front of a Sherman tank like some iron beast ready to charge. Soldiers stood in silence, watching the contraption. Half of them thought it was genius. The other half thought it would get everyone killed. In 48 hours, this machine would either save the invasion or become another burning wreck in a French field. But the man who built it wasn't thinking about glory. He was thinking about the screams, the ones that came every time a tank tried to climb over a hedgerow and exposed its soft belly to German fire. 1 shot, 1 kill, over and over. He'd watched it happen too many times, and he was done watching. The beaches had gone quiet 6 days ago. D-Day was history now. The world had seen the photos, soldiers storming ashore, flags raised over bunkers, victory declared on blood-soaked sand. But inland, the war had stopped moving. Not because of enemy armor, not because of artillery, because of dirt. Ancient walls of earth and stone and roots so tangled they could have been there since the Romans. Farmers had piled them up over centuries, marking boundaries between fields. In peacetime, they were nothing. Quaint little barriers you could walk around. In war, they were fortresses, 15 feet tall in some places, thick as a house, roots digging down deeper than a grave, and they covered every inch of Normandy like some medieval maze designed by God himself to stop tanks. The problem was simple. Every time a Sherman tried to cross one of these hedgerows, it had to tilt upward, climb, expose the one part of the tank that couldn't take a hit, the belly. Thin armor, soft metal, the kind that a Panzerfaust could punch through like paper. And the Germans knew it. They'd wait on the other side, patient, calm, watching the hedgerow line. The moment that Sherman's underside appeared over the top, they'd fire. The explosion would light up the field. Black smoke, orange flames, metal screeching as it twisted and melted. Most crews never made it out. The ones who did, you could see it in their eyes, that hollow, burned-out look, like they'd left part of themselves inside that iron coffin. Sergeant Curtis Coulin watched it happen on June 12th, then June 13th, then again on the 14th, different fields, different crews, same nightmare. He'd stand there afterward while the medics worked and the graves registration teams moved in with their stretchers and tags. He'd smell the burning oil, the scorched metal, the nauseating stench of flesh that had been exposed to heat no human body was designed to withstand. And every time he'd think, there has to be another way. He wasn't an officer, wasn't an engineer, didn't have a college degree or a fancy title. Before the war, Curtis Coulin had been a mechanic in Newark, New Jersey. Fixed cars, repaired trucks, got his hands dirty and his paycheck on time. But he understood something most officers didn't. Machines were just puzzles, and every puzzle had a solution. You just had to be willing to look at it differently. The Army had been trying to solve the hedgerow problem for weeks, artillery bombardments, but the roots just absorbed the shock and held. Explosive charges, but they'd blow craters that tanks couldn't cross. Modified bulldozers, too slow, too vulnerable, and there weren't enough of them anyway. Everything the smart people with degrees and battle plans tried failed, because they were all trying to go over the hedgerows. Coulin had a different idea. What if you didn't go over them at all? What if you went through? He started sketching in a notebook he carried everywhere. Little drawings, angles, measurements, ideas that probably looked insane to anyone watching. His crew noticed. "Cullen's at it again," they'd joke, watching him hunched over his notes by lantern light. "Gonna solve the whole war with a pencil." They meant it kindly. But there was an edge beneath the humor. A lot of smart people had looked at the hedgerow problem. Generals, engineers, West Point graduates. What made one grease monkey sergeant think he could do better? Cullen didn't argue with them, didn't try to explain. He'd learned a long time ago that people underestimated mechanics, thought that working with your hands meant you didn't work with your mind. But every good mechanic was a problem solver. Every broken engine was a mystery. Every stubborn bolt was a puzzle. You learned to see how forces worked, how leverage could multiply strength, how the right tool applied at the right angle could move something that seemed immovable. The hedgerows were just another stubborn machine. They just needed the right tool. And Cullen thought he knew what that tool looked like. He just needed three things: a damaged tank that still ran, some scrap metal, and an officer crazy enough to let him try. Captain Samuel Morrison looked at Cullen like he'd suggested they all fly to Berlin on broomsticks. "Let me make sure I understand this, Sergeant." Morrison's voice was flat, patient, the tone of a man trying very hard not to lose his temper. "You want to take a tank, one that's already been hit once and barely survived, and weld steel spikes to the front of it. Then you want to drive that tank at full speed directly into a solid wall of earth and stone that's been standing for 200 years. And you think this will work?" "Yes, sir." Cullen stood at attention, face expressionless. Inside, his heart hammered. This was it, the moment where his idea either got a chance or died in this tent. Morrison rubbed his face. He looked tired. They all looked tired. 6 days of grinding, bloody combat. 6 days of watching tanks burn and infantry get chewed apart by machine gun fire. 6 days of barely moving 3 miles inland when they were supposed to be halfway to Paris by now. "Explain the logic again," Morrison said finally. Slowly, Cullen took a breath. "Sir, the problem isn't the hedgerows themselves. It's how we're trying to cross them. We tilt up, we expose our belly, they hit us where we're weakest. Every time. It's like walking into the same ambush over and over." Morrison nodded slowly. That much was obvious to everyone. "But if we cut through at ground level," Cullen continued, "we never expose the underside. We keep frontal armor facing the enemy the whole time. They can fire at us all they want. Frontal armor can take it. They need that belly shot to kill a Sherman. If we never give it to them, they can't kill us," Morrison finished. "Exactly, sir." The captain was quiet for a long time, thinking. The logic was sound. Cullen could see that Morrison understood that. But logic didn't mean it would work. And if it failed, if a tank got stuck halfway through a hedgerow, or if the modifications made it too slow, or if the whole thing just came apart under stress, good men would die. Morrison would be the one who'd authorized it. That weight hung in the air between them. Finally, the captain spoke. "How long to build it?" Cullen's pulse jumped. 48 hours, sir. I'll need welding equipment, an acetylene torch, and permission to scavenge metal from the beach obstacles." Morrison stared at him. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You have 48 hours, Sergeant. If this doesn't work, we're both going to be explaining ourselves to some very unhappy people, possibly from a stockade." "Understood, sir." "And Cullen?" "Yes, sir?" Morrison's expression softened just slightly. "I hope to God you're right. Cullen didn't sleep that night. He requisitioned everything he needed: welding gear, torches, a work crew of 3 men who either trusted him or were too tired to argue. Then he headed down to the beaches: Omaha, Utah, Sword, Juneau, Gold. The names were already becoming legend, but the beaches themselves were quieter now. The initial assault was over. Landing craft came and went, bringing supplies, taking wounded, and scattered across the sand, half buried or standing like iron scarecrows, were the obstacles, German beach defenses, designed to rip apart landing craft and stop tanks. Check hedgehogs, 3 heavy steel beams welded together in an X shape, each beam thick as a man's leg, each one weighing hundreds of pounds. The Germans had planted thousands of them, thinking they'd stop the invasion. Instead, they'd just provided Cullen with the exact raw material he needed. He and his crew spent the first night cutting the hedgehogs apart with torches. Blue-white flame hissing through hardened steel. Sparks showering down onto the sand. The smell of hot metal and burning paint. They worked by lamplight, surrounded by the wreckage of war. Shattered landing craft. Burned-out vehicles. Craters from artillery. but Coulin barely noticed. He was focused on the metal, the angles, the lengths. Each prong had to be about 4 feet long, sharp at the tip, reinforced at the base. By dawn, they had 4 prongs ready. Private Eddie Kowalski, one of the welders, looked at the steel teeth lying in the sand. "You really think this'll work, Sarge?" Cullen picked up one of the prongs. Heavy, solid, cold even in the summer heat. "I know it'll work," he said quietly. Physics doesn't lie. The second day was more delicate. They had to weld the prongs to the front of a Sherman without compromising the tank's structural integrity, without interfering with the treads or the gun traverse or the driver's sight lines. Cullen calculated angles carefully, used chalk to mark positions on the hull, 15 degrees downward, spaced wide enough to rip through a 6-foot section, low enough to bite into the base of the hedgerow where the roots were thickest. "Too high and we tilt up anyway," he explained to his crew as they worked. "Too low and we just plow dirt. We need them here." He marked the exact spot with an X. "That gives you optimal cutting action." The welding took hours. Careful, precise work. Each bead had to be perfect, strong enough to hold under massive stress, but not so heavy it threw off the tank's balance. Kowalski worked the torch while Coulin guided his hands, pointing out weak spots, calling for more reinforcement. Around them, other soldiers gathered to watch. Some were impressed, others skeptical. More than a few started taking bets. "Looks like a pig trying to mate with a porcupine," one soldier called out. Cullen didn't look up from his work. "Maybe so," he said, "but this pig's about to root through every hedgerow between here and Berlin." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Nervous laughter, the kind that comes when nobody's sure if they're watching genius or madness. By dawn on the second day, it was done. The Sherman stood in the gray morning light, 4 steel prongs jutting from its front like tusks. Crude, brutal-looking, but solid. Captain Morrison walked around it slowly, examining every weld, testing the strength of the prongs with his boot. Finally, he stepped back. "All right, Sergeant. You've built your mad contraption. Now you need to prove it works." He looked Coulin in the eye. "Tomorrow morning, we find the thickest hedgerow we can and see if this thing is genius or suicide." Coulin couldn't sleep that night either. He lay in his tent, eyes open, running through every calculation in his head. The math was right. The engineering was sound. The welds were solid. But there was a difference between theory and reality. What if the prongs snapped on impact? What if they dug in too deep and the tank got stuck? What if the whole thing just made everything worse? He thought about the crews he'd watched burn, the screams that still echoed in his dreams. If his idea failed tomorrow, he'd be adding more names to that list. And this time, it would be his fault. But if it worked, maybe those screams would finally stop. The test hedgerow stood 12 feet tall. Ancient, thick. The kind of barrier that had probably watched Napoleon's armies march past a century and a half ago. Several officers had gathered to watch. Captain Morrison, Major Jack Williams from Division Headquarters, a couple of intelligence officers with notepads, and the crew who'd volunteered to actually drive the damn thing. Corporal Jake Mitchell on the controls, Sergeant Tom Harrison on the gun, Private First Class Danny Chen loading. They were either the bravest men in Normandy or the craziest, probably both. Coulin stood with the observers, watching the modified Sherman, already nicknamed Rhinoceros by the crew, idle in front of the hedgerow. His mouth was dry. His hands were shaking. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd calculated, came down to the next 60 seconds. Captain Morrison looked at him. "Ready, Sergeant?" Coulin's voice came out steadier than he felt. "As I'll ever be, sir." Morrison raised his arm, held it there for a moment, then dropped it. The signal. The Sherman's engine roared. Black smoke belched from the exhaust. The ground trembled. And then, with gathering speed, 30 tons of steel charged directly at an immovable wall. The impact was thunder. Earth exploded outward in a brown wave. Roots snapped with sounds like rifle cracks. The entire tank shuddered, seeming to stall for a heartbeat. Cullen held his breath. Then, slowly at first, the Sherman began to move forward. The prongs were digging in, biting deep into the ancient earthwork, ripping through roots and stone, creating leverage. The tank tilted forward slightly, nose down, not up. Frontal armor still facing forward, never exposing the vulnerable belly. More roots snapped. Dirt cascaded off the hull like a waterfall. The engine screamed, and then, suddenly, the rhinoceros burst through the other side. The hedgerow had a perfect breach. Wide, clean, low to the ground. The soldiers erupted in cheers. Cullen felt his knees go weak. He actually had to lean against a jeep to keep from falling. It had worked. His crazy idea had actually worked. The crew popped their hatches and emerged, grinning like kids on Christmas morning. "Smoothest hedgerow crossing I've ever experienced," Corporal Mitchell shouted. "We barely felt it inside. And we never once exposed our belly." Major Williams approached Cullen. His expression was serious. "Sergeant, how many of these modifications can you produce? And how fast?" Cullen's mind raced. "Sir, if I get enough welders and access to more hedgehog obstacles, my crew could modify 10 tanks a day. Maybe more if we push it." Williams shook his head. "Not good enough." Cullen's heart sank. Then the major smiled. "I'm getting you 50 welders and all the steel you need. I want 100 tanks modified by the end of the week. And I'm sending a report to General Bradley immediately." He clapped Cullen on the shoulder. "This invention, Sergeant, is going to change everything." But Captain Morrison wasn't celebrating yet. "Sergeant," he said quietly, pulling Cullen aside, "one successful test doesn't mean it'll work in combat. We need to try this against an actual German position, with real enemy fire. That's the only way to know if it's truly effective." Cullen swallowed hard. He'd been hoping to stay back and just build more modifications. Let other crews test it in battle. But Morrison was right. If there were problems, design flaws he hadn't anticipated, he needed to be there to see them, to understand why, to fix them. "When do we go, sir?" "Tomorrow at dawn. There's a German strong point 2 miles from here. They've been holding up our advance for 3 days. Every approach is blocked by hedgerows. Every attempt to cross has been suicide." Morrison met his eyes. "If your modification works there under fire, it'll prove your concept beyond any doubt. And I'm assigning you to the tank as technical advisor. You'll ride with Mitchell's crew." The implication was clear. If something went wrong, Cullen needed to be there, to witness it, to fix it, or to die with it. "Understood, sir. I'll be ready." That night, Cullen checked every weld on the rhinoceros by lantern light, tightened every bolt, examined every prong for stress fractures. Everything looked solid. But combat was different from a controlled test. In battle, nothing went according to plan. Private Chen found him still working after midnight. "Sergeant, you should get some rest. Big day tomorrow." "Can't sleep, Chen." "You scared?" Cullen considered lying, then decided honesty was better. Terrified. "This thing works in theory. Worked in one test. But tomorrow, people's lives depend on whether I got the math right. If I made a mistake somewhere, if there's a flaw I didn't see." He didn't finish the sentence. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. "We trust you, Sarge. You built this thing. You know it better than anyone. And tomorrow, we're going to plow through those hedgerows and show the Germans they can't hide anymore." Cullen wished he had Chen's confidence. All he could do was prepare as best he could, and pray that his mad idea was actually genius. Dawn broke cold and gray over Normandy. Drizzle fell from low clouds, turning everything to mud and mist. Cullen climbed into the rhinoceros, taking position in the commander's cupola, where he could observe and advise. His stomach churned. His hands trembled slightly. The plan was straightforward. Their tank would lead a small column toward the German strong point. They'd use the hedgerow cutter to breach barriers that had stopped all previous advances. Infantry would follow, using the breaches to advance without being caught in German killing zones. Simple in theory, But theory and reality were about to meet. "Mount up!" came the order. Engines rumbled to life across the staging area. The rhinoceros shuddered beneath Coulin, its steel prongs gleaming wetly in the dawn light. They rolled forward. The first hedgerow appeared through the mist. According to intelligence, a German machine gun nest waited on the other side. It had been mowing down American infantry for days. The old tactic would have been to climb over, expose the belly, give the Germans an easy shot with a Panzerfaust. Not anymore. "Steady," Coulin said over the intercom, voice surprisingly calm. "Hit it at a slight angle, about 20 degrees. That'll help the prongs bite in." "Roger that," Mitchell replied. The impact came like a freight train hitting a brick wall. Earth exploded. Roots snapped. Inside the tank, the crew was thrown forward against their restraints. But nothing broke. The prongs held. The tank pushed forward, engine screaming, treads churning, ripping through centuries-old growth like it was paper. And then they were through. The other side of the hedgerow opened before them. A German machine gun crew scrambling for their weapon, faces pale with shock. They'd been waiting for a tank to appear slowly over the top of the hedgerow. Vulnerable. Easy to kill. Instead, 30 tons of steel burst through the wall itself, gun already tracking toward them. The Sherman's 75mm spoke first, one high-explosive round. The German position vanished in fire and smoke. "It works!" Chen shouted over the intercom. "It actually works in combat." But there was no time to celebrate. More hedgerows lay ahead. Behind each one, more Germans. The rhinoceros continued its advance, breach after breach. Each time, the prongs performed perfectly. Each time, the tank emerged with frontal armor still facing forward, never exposing its vulnerable underside. The infantry following behind were ecstatic. For the first time since D-Day, they could advance without being pinned down. They poured through the breaches, clearing German positions that had seemed impregnable just hours before. Then came the real test. "Contact front," Harrison called out. "Panther tank, partial cover behind hedgerow." Coulin's blood went cold. A Panther, German heavy armor. Its 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman at long range with ease. If they got stuck breaching the hedgerow, they'd be a sitting duck. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "Rhinoceros, you're clear to disengage. Call for artillery support." Cullen grabbed the mic before Mitchell could respond. "Negative. We're breaching." "Sergeant, we go through fast. We emerge with our gun already aimed. Speed is our advantage. Trust the modification, sir." A pause. Then Morrison's voice came back, tight with tension. "Your call, Sergeant. Make it count." Mitchell didn't hesitate. The Sherman surged forward. This hedgerow was thicker than any they'd hit yet. The impact was massive, like hitting a mountain. For a terrifying moment, the tank seemed to slow, the prongs struggling against the dense mass. "More power!" Coulin shouted. "Everything you've got!" The engine howled. Smoke poured from the exhausts. The treads threw up huge clouds of earth. Inch by inch, the rhinoceros forced its way through. They burst out the other side at an angle. Not perfect, but good enough. Harrison had kept his gun trained on where the Panther should be. And there it was, turret still turning to track their unexpected appearance. Harrison fired first. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther's side armor thinner than its frontal plate and punched through. The German tank shuddered. Smoke poured from its hatches. The crew bailed out, hands raised. The rhinoceros's machine guns persuaded them to surrender rather than fight. Infantry caught up moments later, securing the prisoners. An officer approached the tank, grinning broadly. "Sergeant Coulin, I don't know what kind of witchcraft you worked on this tank, but you just did in 2 hours what we've been trying to do for 3 days. That German strong point is finished." Coulin climbed out, legs shaky. He'd done it. The design worked, not just in a test, but in actual combat. Against real enemy positions, under fire. His mad idea had proven itself. Within 48 hours, every tank depot in Normandy received the same order. Install Coulin hedgerow cutters. Immediately. all available armor. The Army brought in welding teams from engineering battalions. They scavenged more Czech hedgehogs from the beaches. They set up assembly lines in muddy fields, working around the clock. Cullen found himself pulled from his unit and assigned to train welding crews. He went from depot to depot, showing them the exact angles for the prongs, the proper welding techniques, the reinforcement methods that would keep the cutters from snapping under stress. The key, he'd explain to each new group of welders, is that the prongs have to dig in low. If they're too high, the tank tilts up and exposes its belly. Too low, and they just plow dirt without cutting roots. You want them positioned exactly here. He'd mark the spot with chalk, 15 degrees downward. That gives you optimal cutting action. Some welders were skeptical at first. The design looked crude, just steel prongs stuck on a tank. But when they saw combat footage of rhinoceros tanks plowing through hedgerows that had stopped everything else, skepticism turned to enthusiasm. They worked faster, took pride in the modifications they were installing. Within a week, hundreds of tanks sported the distinctive steel tusks. Within 2 weeks, thousands. General Omar Bradley visited one of the modification sites personally. He found Cullen elbow-deep in a welding project, training a new crew. "Sergeant Cullen, I presume?" Cullen snapped to attention, recognizing the stars on Bradley's collar. "Yes, sir." "At ease, Sergeant," Bradley smiled. "I came to see the man who unstuck my army." He walked around the modified tank, examining the welds. "Your invention is brilliant in its simplicity. We've been throwing sophisticated engineering solutions at the hedgerow problem for weeks. Artillery barrages, explosive charges, modified bulldozers. Nothing worked consistently." He turned to Cullen. "And then you come along with scrap metal and a welding torch and solve it in 2 days. How did you think of it?" Cullen hesitated, then spoke honestly. "I just watched tanks burn, sir. Watched crews die. And I thought, there has to be a better way. I'm a mechanic. I fix things. This seemed like something that needed fixing." Bradley nodded slowly. "The best solutions usually come from the people closest to the problem. Not from some general's tent." He extended his hand. "I'm recommending you for the Legion of Merit, and I'm authorizing a field promotion to technical sergeant. This army needs more men who can think outside the box." After Bradley left, Cullen's crew mobbed him with congratulations. But Cullen felt conflicted. He was being lauded as a genius, receiving medals and promotions. But men were still dying in Normandy. His invention was helping, but it wasn't magic. The war was far from over. Private Kowalski pulled him aside. "You okay, Sarge? You don't seem too excited about all this." Cullen stared at the modified tanks lined up for deployment. "I keep thinking about all the crews we lost before this invention. What if I'd thought of it sooner? What if I'd pushed harder to get it tested?" Kowalski's expression turned serious. "You can't think like that. You can't save the guys who died before, but you're saving the guys who are still alive. Every day, more tanks with your cutters are rolling through hedgerows. Every day, fewer crews are burning." He gripped Cullen's shoulder. "That's what matters, Sarge." Cullen knew Kowalski was right, but the guilt still gnawed at him in the quiet moments. War didn't give you time for if only. It demanded that you keep moving forward, keep solving problems, keep trying to save whoever you could save today. By August, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began the race across France, the hedgerow cutters had become standard equipment. New Sherman tanks rolling off production lines in the United States were being manufactured with cutter attachment points already welded in place. Cullen's field modification had become an official part of tank design. He'd literally changed how tanks were built. But as Allied forces pushed beyond Normandy into more open terrain, the cutters saw less use for their original purpose. Then tankers discovered something Cullen hadn't anticipated. The steel prongs had other applications. In urban warfare, they proved excellent for smashing through brick walls and wooden barricades. Tank crews used them to breach buildings where German snipers had taken position. The psychological effect was devastating. The sound of a 30-ton tank crashing through a wall was enough to convince many German defenders to surrender rather than fight. During river crossings, crews found that cutters provided additional traction when tanks had to climb muddy banks. The prongs dug into slippery soil, preventing tanks from sliding backward. In winter warfare, cutters helped push through snowdrifts that would have otherwise bogged down vehicles. Hewlin, now a master sergeant attached to an engineering evaluation team, traveled to different units to study these creative applications. "I never imagined my hedgerow cutters would be used for all this," he wrote in a letter home. "I just wanted to get through Norman hedgerows. But soldiers are creative. They'll use any tool for whatever. Purpose serves them." The most unexpected application came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. German forces had created extensive roadblocks using felled trees. Tank crews discovered that hedgerow cutters could push aside or break through these obstacles, allowing armored columns to maintain momentum. One after-action report described a Sherman crew using their cutter to literally push a disabled German tank out of a narrow road. "I built a tool to cut through bushes," Cullen would say, shaking his head in amazement. And now they're using it to move disabled panzers. War makes you creative, I guess, but not everything was positive. Some tanks suffered equipment failures when cutters were used beyond their design specifications. Prongs snapped off when crews tried to push through reinforced concrete. Welds failed under excessive stress. There were even friendly fire incidents when other units didn't recognize modified tanks in poor visibility and mistook the prong silhouette for enemy equipment. Cullen worked with Army engineers to develop better training materials. "The cutter is a tool, not magic," he'd emphasize in training sessions. "It has limitations. Use it wrong and you'll break it or get someone killed. Use it right, and it'll save your life." And there was another cost he hadn't anticipated, a moral one. When tanks gained the ability to breach hedgerows rapidly, commanders began using armor more aggressively. Some attacks that might have been delayed or canceled were now launched with the expectation that tanks could overcome any obstacle. This led to casualties that better caution might have prevented. Cullen wrestled with this guilt during a rare conversation with Chaplain Thomas O'Brien. "Did I give commanders a tool that made them overconfident?" he wondered aloud. O'Brien replied gently, "You gave them a tool that saved lives. What commanders chose to do with that tool, the tactical decisions they made, that's on them, not you. You can't control how people use what you create. You can only try to create things that do more good than harm." Cullen wanted to believe that. He needed to believe that. But the moral calculus of war was never simple. There was also the matter of the German defenders. The hedgerow cutters had shortened the Normandy campaign, which saved Allied lives. But it also meant German soldiers who might have survived a longer, more cautious advance were instead killed in the rapid push the cutters enabled. "I killed people I never saw," he confided to Kowalski one evening. "Not directly, but my invention put tanks in positions where they could kill more effectively. I'm being decorated for that. Medals for making killing more efficient." He paused. "It feels wrong somehow." Kowalski was quiet for a moment, then spoke. "You know what feels wrong to me? Watching good men burn in tanks because we couldn't breach hedgerows without exposing ourselves. You stopped that. Yes, your invention killed Germans. It's a weapon modification. That's what it's supposed to do. But it also saved Americans." He met Cullen's eyes. "More importantly, it shortened the war. Every day this war continues, people die. Americans, Germans, French civilians caught in the crossfire. Your invention helped end it faster. That saves lives on all sides, even if it doesn't feel like it." Cullen wanted to believe that too. But belief didn't come easy in a war zone. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Cullen stood with his unit in a small German town, watching soldiers celebrate. Joy, relief, exhaustion. Emotions too complex to name. The hedgerow cutters had played their part in victory. By most estimates, they'd shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks, possibly months. That acceleration had cascading effects. Faster advance across France, quicker liberation of Paris, earlier crossing of the Rhine, sooner arrival in Berlin. Every day saved meant lives saved. Official citations credited the Kulin hedgerow cutter with materially contributing to the successful conclusion of the Normandy campaign and subsequent operations in the European theater. General Eisenhower himself called it one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war. Kulin's received the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, a commendation from the Supreme Allied Commander. His name appeared in newspapers back home. He became a symbol of American ingenuity, the average soldier who'd used common sense and scrap metal to solve a problem that had stumped experts. But as he stood in that German town watching the celebrations, Kulin felt empty. The problem he'd solved no longer mattered. The war was over. The hedgerows of Normandy were a year in the past. His invention, revolutionary as it had been, was now just a footnote in the history of a conflict that had killed tens of millions. Kowalski appeared beside him with 2 bottles of liberated German beer. "You're thinking too much again." Kulin accepted a bottle. "Just reflecting. A year ago, I was welding prongs onto a tank, hoping my idea would work. Now the war's over, and I'm trying to figure out what any of it meant." Kowalski took a long drink. "It meant you saved lives." "My life, probably. I was infantry before I got transferred to your welding crew. If I'd stayed infantry, if tanks hadn't been able to breach hedgerows, I'd probably be dead. So would hundreds of other guys." He looked at Kulin. "Your invention mattered, Sarge. Don't ever doubt that." They drank in silence as the sun set over a ruined Germany. Kulin thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. If he'd dismissed his initial idea as too simple, if Morrison had refused permission, if the first test had failed, if the combat trial had gone wrong, any one of those moments could have changed everything. "You know what's strange?" Kulin said after a while. "I keep thinking about German tankers. They were sitting behind hedgerows, confident they were safe. Then suddenly, American tanks are bursting through barriers that were supposed to be impenetrable." He paused. What must that have felt like? To have the rules of warfare change on you overnight? Kowalski shrugged. "Probably felt like losing, which is what they deserved for starting this whole mess." Kulin nodded slowly, but he couldn't quite shake the thought. War was full of innovations, each side constantly trying to gain an edge, to surprise the enemy, to change the rules. His hedgerow cutter was just one example among countless others. Radar, proximity fuses, improved armor, better tactics. Each innovation made someone's defensive position obsolete, their careful preparations worthless. That was the nature of warfare, but it was also the nature of progress. When you solved a problem in war, you weren't just defeating the enemy. You were proving that problems could be solved. That human ingenuity could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. "I wonder what'll happen to all those cutters now," Kulin mused. "Thousands of tanks with my prongs welded on. What do you do with them when there are no more hedgerows to cut through?" "Scrap them, probably," Kowalski said. "Or leave them on as souvenirs. Either way, they did their job." He raised his bottle. "That's all any tool can ask for." Curtis Kulin returned home to Newark, New Jersey in late 1945, carrying decorations and memories. But ready to leave the war behind, he went back to his old job, fixing cars and trucks in a small garage on Mulberry Street. The skills that had made him a wartime innovator served him well in peacetime. He was good with machines, good at solving problems, good at seeing solutions others missed. But he never talked much about the hedgerow cutter. When customers or friends would ask about his war experiences, he'd deflect. "I was a mechanic. Fixed tanks. Nothing exciting." He didn't mention the medals, the innovations, the fact that his invention had changed the course of the Normandy campaign. His wife Margaret once asked him why he was so reluctant to discuss his wartime achievements. "You're a genuine hero," she said. You should be proud. Cullen was quiet for a long moment, then spoke softly. I'm proud of what I did, but I'm not proud of what it was for. I made a tool that helped kill people. It saved American lives, which matters, but it was still about killing. He looked at his oil-stained hands. I'd rather focus on fixing things now, not on how I helped break things then. Margaret didn't push. She understood. Some men came home from the war wanting to relive every moment, to tell every story. Others came home wanting to forget. Curtis Cullen was one of the latter. Over the decades, military historians gradually recognized the significance of the Cullen hedgerow cutter. It appeared in books about the Normandy campaign, in documentaries about World War II innovations, in military training manuals as an example of field expedient engineering. But Cullen himself remained largely unknown outside military history circles. He was content with that. In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, a young historian named David Carter tracked down Cullen, now 73 years old, long retired, living in a modest house with a garden he tended himself. Carter was writing a book about tactical innovations in World War II. He wanted to interview the inventor of the hedgerow cutter. They sat on Cullen's back porch, drinking iced tea, while Carter's tape recorder captured every word. Mr. Cullen, do you understand how significant your invention was? Carter asked. Military analysts estimate it shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks, saved thousands of lives, changed tank warfare doctrine, and it all came from you, a sergeant with no engineering degree, in just 48 hours. Cullen was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his words would later appear in Carter's book as the perfect summary of American ingenuity. I wasn't special. I was just a guy who knew how machines worked and saw a problem that needed solving. The special part was that the Army gave me a chance to try. He leaned forward slightly. How many other good ideas got dismissed because they came from the wrong person? How many problems went unsolved because someone said, "That's not how we do things"? I got lucky. My crazy idea got tested. He paused. But I guarantee you there were 100 other guys with equally good ideas that nobody listened to. Carter pressed. But your idea worked. That makes you special. Cullen shook his head gently. My idea worked because people gave it a chance. Captain Morrison could have said no. The test crew could have refused. Division could have rejected it after the first combat trial. But they didn't. His eyes grew distant, remembering. They looked at the idea, not at who was suggesting it. That's the real lesson. Not that I was some genius, but that good ideas can come from anywhere, if you're willing to listen. Curtis Cullen died in 1963. His obituary in the Newark Star-Ledger mentioned that he'd been a mechanic, a veteran, and a quiet man who preferred fixing things to talking about them. It didn't mention the hedgerow cutter. Most of his neighbors never knew that the old man who'd fixed their cars had changed the course of World War II. But in military museums across America and Europe, examples of the Cullen hedgerow cutter are preserved. Chunks of hardened steel welded to the front of Sherman tanks. Simple looking, crude even, but revolutionary in their effectiveness. Plaques explain what they are, what they did, how they changed the invasion of Europe. And occasionally, they mention the name Curtis Cullen, the mad mechanic who refused to accept that problems were unsolvable. The sergeant from Newark who watched tanks burn and decided there had to be a better way. The man who proved that the best innovations don't always come from laboratories or think tanks. Sometimes they come from a mechanic with a welding torch, working by lantern light on a beach in Normandy, turning German obstacles into American solutions. The steel teeth still gleam in those museums, preserved behind glass, silent now, no longer cutting through ancient hedgerows or smashing through enemy walls. But if you look closely, you can still see the weld marks, the reinforcement points, the careful angles that Cullen calculated with nothing but a notebook and common sense. Every mark tells a story of a problem that seemed impossible, of an idea that seemed insane, of a test that could have ended in disaster. of a battle that proved the impossible was possible after all, and of the thousands of tank crews who came home alive because one stubborn mechanic refused to accept that there was no better way. The hedgerows of Normandy are still there today, softer now, gentler, no longer barriers between life and death. Tourists walk past them on D-Day anniversary tours, barely noticing the ancient earthworks. But sometimes, if you stand quiet and still, you can almost hear it. The roar of a Sherman engine, the crash of steel meeting stone, the snap of roots giving way, the sound of a problem being solved, one weld at a time. That day didn't just change the war. It changed every man who lived to tell the story. And in the end, maybe that's what innovation really is. Not just solving problems, but saving lives. Not just changing battles, but changing history. One mad idea at a time.